The book cartwheels squeaked softly against the polished library floor as Sarah Martinez pushed it between the towering shelves, her movements precise and measured. To the college students sprawled across study tables, she was invisible, just another middle-aged librarian in sensible shoes and wire-rimmed glasses, someone who shushed too loudly and enforced late fees with the determination of a drill sergeant. They had no idea how accurate that comparison really was. When the campus security alert crackled through the afternoon silence, announcing an active shooter situation, panic erupted like a flashbang in the quiet sanctuary of knowledge. Students screamed, chairs toppled, and chaos consumed the space that moments before had been filled with nothing more threatening than whispered conversations and turning pages. But while everyone else froze or fled, Sarah Martinez didn't hesitate. Her hands moved with muscle memory forged in the crucible of combat. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded respect in the world's most dangerous places, and her eyes held the steady calm of a warrior who had stared death in the face and never blinked. What happened next would shatter every assumption about the quiet woman who had spent 3 years recommending romance novels and helping freshmen find research materials. Because sometimes the most extraordinary heroes hide in the most ordinary places, and sometimes the skills that save lives in foreign battlefields translate perfectly to protecting innocent civilians in the place they should feel safest. Before we dive into Sarah's incredible story, take a moment to honor the veterans in your life by hitting that subscribe button and ringing the notification bell. These stories of hidden heroes deserve to be shared, and your engagement helps us bring more of these powerful narratives to light. Drop a comment below about a veteran you know whose service has impacted your life, because every story of service matters, and every act of recognition helps heal the gap between military and civilian communities. Sarah Martinez had mastered the delicate art of becoming unremarkable, a skill she had never learned in any military training manual, but had perfected through 3 years of deliberate practice at Riverside Community College. Every morning at 7:30 she unlocked the library doors with the same measured precision she had once used to clear weapons before patrol, but now her battlefield was filled with dusty encyclopedias and overdue notices instead of improvised explosive devices and casualty reports. The transformation had been so complete, so carefully constructed, that even she sometimes forgot the woman she used to be. The students saw exactly what she wanted them to see. A helpful but unremarkable middle-aged librarian who wore cardigans that had gone out of style sometime during the Clinton administration, and sensible shoes that squeaked just loud enough to announce her approach to anyone engaged in unauthorized food consumption near the computers. They knew she could locate any book in the sprawling collection with supernatural efficiency, that she possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of research databases, and that she defended the quiet study areas with the territorial intensity of a mother bear protecting her cubs. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that every one of these seemingly innocent behaviors was actually the civilian application of skills learned during 12 years of military service that had taken her from the sun-baked training grounds of Fort Sam Houston to the blood-soaked forward operating bases of Afghanistan's Helmand province. None of them noticed the way Sarah positioned herself at the circulation desk with clear sight lines to all 3 entrances, or how her eyes performed automatic threat assessments every time someone new walked through the doors. They didn't recognize the subtle hypervigilance that caused her to pause her work whenever she heard unexpected sounds in the stacks, or the way she unconsciously cataloged potential cover positions and escape routes during her routine walks through the building. These weren't the habits of a paranoid civilian. They were the survival instincts of someone who had spent years in environments where complacency was measured in body bags, and situational awareness was the difference between coming home and coming home in a flag-draped coffin. The carefully constructed persona of librarian Sarah Martinez was a masterpiece of concealment that had required her to bury Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez so deep that sometimes she wondered if that woman had ever really existed at all. The transition from military to civilian life had been like learning to breathe underwater. Everything that had once felt natural and automatic became forced and conscious. Every interaction filtered through the exhausting process of remembering to be normal instead of being ready. She had traded her combat boots for sensible flats, her ACU uniform for cardigans, and khakis, her tactical awareness for the gentle vigilance required to maintain order in a place dedicated to learning instead of fighting. But some transformations are never complete, and some skills never truly fade. They only lie dormant, waiting in the muscle memory and neural pathways like sleeping soldiers ready to answer the call to duty. Sarah had learned to hide her military bearing so well that colleagues complimented her on her calm demeanor during stressful situations, never realizing that her definition of stress had been calibrated by mortar attacks and mass casualty events. She had become fluent in the civilian language of gentle suggestions and polite requests, but underneath that careful veneer, the voice that had once directed medical evacuations under enemy fire still carried the authority to move mountains when lives hung in the balance. The students who complained about her strict policies regarding late returns and food restrictions had no idea they were testing boundaries enforced by someone who had once been responsible for maintaining discipline and morale in a combat zone where failure meant death. Her insistence on proper procedures and attention to detail wasn't the pedantry of a bureaucrat. It was the professional standards of someone who had learned that corners cut in preparation often became corners carved from coffins. Even her legendary ability to remain calm during finals week, when the library transformed into a pressure cooker of academic anxiety and sleep-deprived desperation, was simply the civilian application of grace under pressure, learned in far more dangerous circumstances. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had found peace in a place dedicated to the preservation and dissemination of knowledge, including the military histories and veteran memoirs that she carefully shelved without allowing herself to read. Every day she walked past books that told stories similar to her own, stories of service and sacrifice of warriors who had answered their nation's call and then struggled to find their place in the world they had fought to protect. But Sarah had made her peace with civilian life by creating clear boundaries between who she had been and who she needed to become. And those boundaries had held firm for 3 years of careful, deliberate normality. Until the afternoon when the campus alert system shattered the library's peaceful silence, and Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez discovered that some transformations are never permanent, and some calls to duty echo across time and circumstance with a clarity that makes pretending impossible. The woman who had spent years learning to be invisible was about to discover that heroism, like military training, never really leaves. It only waits for the moment when ordinary people must do extraordinary things, and the skills learned in service to country become the tools needed to serve humanity itself. The campus alert system's harsh electronic voice cut through the library's afternoon tranquility like a blade through silk, each word delivered with the mechanical precision that made emergency announcements simultaneously authoritative and terrifying. Active shooter on campus, lockdown in effect immediately. Seek shelter, avoid windows, wait for law enforcement. The message repeated twice before silence returned, but that silence was no longer peaceful. It was the pregnant quiet that precedes catastrophe, heavy with the weight of lives suddenly balanced on the knife's edge between safety and tragedy. What followed was the kind of chaos that no amount of training can truly prepare civilians to handle, a perfect storm of panic and confusion that transformed the library's orderly rows of knowledge into a maze of terror. 63 students and staff members who had been quietly pursuing education and employment discovered in the space of heartbeats that all their active shooter drills, all their theoretical discussions about emergency procedures, meant absolutely nothing when faced with the genuine possibility of violence and death. Chairs toppled as students dove for cover behind inadequate desks, textbooks scattered across the floor like fallen leaves, and the whispered conversations that had been the library's soundtrack dissolved into a cacophony of sobs, prayers, and barely controlled panic. Sarah Martinez felt the familiar sensation that combat veterans know but can never adequately describe to civilians. Time dilating and crystallizing simultaneously, awareness sharpening to supernatural clarity, while the world seemed to slow down enough for every detail to be examined and catalogued. The transformation was as automatic as breathing, and as complete as sunrise, her carefully maintained civilian persona cracking like ice under pressure as 12 years of military training took control of her nervous system and conscious mind. The timid librarian who had spent her morning helping a freshman locate sources for his sociology paper disappeared entirely, replaced by combat medic Martinez, a woman who had earned her rank and reputation by saving lives under enemy fire in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Her body moved with the fluid precision of muscle memory, while her mind began calculating variables with the cold efficiency that had once made her indispensable to forward surgical teams in Afghanistan. 63 potential casualties requiring protection and evacuation. 3 primary entrances that could become entry points for a hostile force. Multiple levels and blind corners that could conceal threats or provide cover for non-combatants. Limited communication with outside support and no reliable intelligence about the nature or location of the threat. These weren't the panicked thoughts of a terrified civilian. They were the tactical assessments of someone whose military occupational specialty had been preserving human life in environments designed to destroy it. The students huddled behind overturned tables and crouched between bookshelves had no idea that their quiet librarian was conducting a rapid threat assessment with the same systematic thoroughness she had once applied to triaging casualties during rocket attacks on forward operating bases. They couldn't know that her calm demeanor wasn't the result of shock or denial, but the professional composure of someone who had learned to function effectively when adrenaline and terror threatened to override rational thought. Her 3 years of civilian life hadn't erased her military training. They had simply provided time for that training to mature and integrate, creating a synthesis of warrior and caregiver that was about to prove invaluable. Sarah's eyes swept the library with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions under pressure, cataloging resources and obstacles with the same attention to detail she had once applied to establishing casualty collection points under hostile fire. The heavy wooden tables could provide temporary cover, but wouldn't stop high-velocity rounds. The computer terminals offered concealment but no protection. The stacks themselves could serve as a maze to confuse and delay a threat, but they also created multiple blind spots and potential ambush sites. Every observation was filtered through years of experience that had taught her the crucial difference between cover and concealment, between tactical advantage and fatal error. The fear in the room was palpable, thick as smoke from a burning vehicle, but Sarah recognized it as something she could work with rather than something that would paralyze her. Fear was information. It meant her people understood the gravity of the situation and would be motivated to follow clear, confident leadership. The crying and whispering that filled the air wasn't chaos to her trained ears. It was intelligence about the emotional and psychological state of her charges, data she could use to determine who would need extra support and who might be capable of helping with the protection of others. As the reality of the situation settled over the library like a suffocating blanket, Sarah Martinez made the conscious decision to stop hiding who she really was. The students and colleagues who had known her as a gentle, unassuming librarian were about to discover that sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in plain sight, and sometimes the skills learned in service to country become the tools needed to protect innocent lives when evil walks through the door. Her transformation from civilian to warrior wasn't a choice. It was a calling that echoed across time and circumstance with the clarity of duty and the weight of honor. The woman who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisibility was about to become impossible to ignore, and the library that had been her sanctuary was about to become her battlefield. But this time, instead of treating wounded soldiers under enemy fire, she would be protecting students and colleagues whose only crime was seeking knowledge in what should have been the safest place on campus. The mission parameters had changed, but the core objective remained exactly the same as it had always been for combat medic Martinez. Everyone goes home alive. The first distant gunshots echoed through the building's corridors like thunder rolling across distant mountains, and Sarah Martinez felt her civilian facade shatter completely as 12 years of combat experience surged through her bloodstream like liquid fire. The transformation was so complete and instantaneous that students later would struggle to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the warrior who emerged from behind the circulation desk. This wasn't the gradual revelation of hidden depths. This was the sudden, overwhelming manifestation of someone whose entire identity had been forged in the crucible of combat medicine and tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Combat medic Martinez moved through the terrified crowd with the fluid authority of someone accustomed to bringing order to chaos, her voice carrying the steel-edged confidence that had once directed helicopter medical evacuations under enemy fire in Afghanistan's most contested territories. The gentle suggestions and polite requests that had characterized her civilian interactions disappeared entirely, replaced by the clear, unambiguous commands of someone whose words had literally been the difference between life and death for countless wounded soldiers. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, no civilian politeness that might cost precious seconds when lives hung in the balance. "Everyone listen to me right now," she commanded, her voice cutting through the panic with surgical precision. "We're going to move away from the windows and get behind hard cover. I need the athletes and anyone with military or emergency training to help me move these tables." The students who had spent years seeing her as background furniture suddenly found themselves responding to leadership they hadn't known existed, their bodies obeying the authority in her voice even as their minds struggled to process the transformation. This wasn't their librarian anymore. This was someone who clearly knew how to function when normal rules no longer applied. Sarah's tactical assessment of the library continued with the systematic thoroughness she had learned during urban combat training at Fort Leonard Wood, but now her evaluation included the human resources available to her as well as the physical environment. Jessica Chen from the volleyball team had the height and strength to help move furniture quickly and quietly. Marcus Williams, whose military science textbooks had given away his ROTC participation, understood enough about command structure to serve as a squad leader for one group. Rebecca Foster from the nursing program would have basic medical training that could prove invaluable if casualties occurred. Every person in the room became a potential asset or liability in her rapidly developing defensive strategy. The library's layout, which she had known intimately as a civilian workspace, transformed in her military mind into a tactical environment with distinct advantages and vulnerabilities. The main reading area offered good fields of fire but limited cover, while the stacks provided concealment and multiple fallback positions, but could become fatal funnels if not properly managed. The computer lab in the back corner had only one entrance, making it either a perfect safe room or a potential death trap depending on how the situation developed. Her positioning of people wasn't random. It was based on years of experience establishing casualty collection points and defensive perimeters in far more dangerous environments. As she directed the movement of furniture and people with the efficiency of someone conducting a well-rehearsed military operation, Sarah's mind was simultaneously running multiple tactical scenarios based on variables she had learned to consider during combat operations. Single shooter versus multiple attackers, planned assault versus crimes of passion, professional training versus amateur violence. Each possibility required different defensive strategies and different risk assessments, but all of them benefited from the same fundamental principles she had learned during her military service. Maintain security, establish communication, prepare for casualties, and never stop fighting until everyone possible had been saved. The students who found themselves following her orders discovered that fear and confusion could be transformed into purposeful action under the right leadership. Marcus Williams, recognizing military bearing when he saw it, began helping organize the younger students with an efficiency that reflected his own developing military training. Jessica Chen and two other athletes formed an impromptu security team, positioning themselves where they could observe approaches and provide early warning of threats. The transformation wasn't just in Sarah. It was in everyone who found themselves rising to meet the extraordinary circumstances under her guidance. But Sarah's greatest advantage wasn't her tactical knowledge or her ability to organize people under pressure. It was her intimate understanding of trauma and her absolute refusal to accept preventable casualties. Combat medicine had taught her that survival often came down to preparation, training, and the willingness to make hard decisions when emotions screamed for different choices. She had learned to function in the space between panic and paralysis, to think clearly when others couldn't think at all, and to maintain hope when hope seemed impossible to justify. The woman who had once treated sucking chest wounds while mortars fell around her aid station was now applying those same life-saving instincts to protecting college students whose greatest previous emergency had probably been a failed exam or a relationship breakup. But the principles remained constant. Assess the situation, prioritize threats, establish security, treat casualties, and never stop fighting for every life under your responsibility. The environment had changed from desert combat zones to academic libraries, but the core mission of Combat Medic Martinez had never wavered. Everyone goes home alive. As the sound of gunshots grew closer, and the reality of imminent danger settled over the improvised fortress she had created in the library, Sarah Martinez realized that her 3 years of civilian life hadn't been an escape from service. They had been preparation for a different kind of battlefield, where the enemy was still evil and the stakes were still life and death, but the people depending on her protection were students and teachers instead of soldiers and Marines. The uniform had changed, the location had changed, but the calling remained exactly the same, and Combat Medic Martinez was ready to answer that calling one more time. The library's main doors exploded inward with the distinctive sound of splintering wood and twisted metal, a noise that Sarah Martinez recognized with the sick familiarity of someone who had heard similar sounds during vehicle-borne improvised explosive device attacks in Afghanistan. The shooter entered with the methodical precision of someone who had planned this moment, his weapon sweeping the room in practiced arcs that spoke of training and preparation rather than impulsive rage. In that crystalline moment of recognition, Sarah realized she was facing her worst nightmare scenario, a credible threat with tactical knowledge in an environment filled with innocent civilians who had nowhere to run and no experience in fighting back. The students who had been following her defensive preparations with confused compliance suddenly understood why their quiet librarian had been positioning them with such military precision. The overturned tables that had seemed like theater props in an emergency drill became literal lifesavers as high-velocity rounds chewed through plaster walls and shattered computer monitors. The defensive positions she had established based on fields of fire and cover angles proved their worth as her people remained protected while chaos erupted around them. Every decision she had made in those first crucial minutes was now being validated by gunfire and flying debris. But heroes aren't defined by their equipment or their position. They're defined by their willingness to stand between evil and innocence regardless of the odds stacked against them. Sarah Martinez had no weapon except her training, no backup except her experience, and no support except her absolute refusal to allow innocent people to die on her watch. The tactical situation was as clear as it was terrifying. A trained shooter with superior firepower, moving through an environment where she had responsibility for 63 lives and no military assets except her own knowledge and determination. Using urban combat techniques learned during military police training at Fort Leonard Wood and refined through multiple deployments in hostile territories, Sarah began a deadly game of movement and concealment through the library's maze of shelves and study carrels. Every step was calculated based on sound discipline, visual concealment, and tactical advantage. Every pause was timed to gather intelligence about the shooter's position and intentions. The woman who had once conducted reconnaissance patrols through Taliban-controlled villages was now applying those same skills to protecting students in the place where they should have felt safest. Her knowledge of the building's layout became a force multiplier that transformed disadvantage into opportunity, allowing her to move through areas the shooter couldn't anticipate while avoiding the fatal funnels that could turn tactical movement into suicide. The emergency exits she had memorized during 3 years of civilian employment became potential escape routes for her people. The blind corners and sightlines she had unconsciously cataloged during thousands of routine workdays became the tactical terrain features that would determine who lived and who died in the next few minutes. The shooter's methodical approach through the main reading area gave Sarah the intelligence she needed to formulate a plan that balanced aggression with protection of non-combatants. His movement patterns suggested military or law enforcement training, which meant he would be expecting conventional responses and civilian panic, rather than organized resistance from someone with comparable tactical knowledge. His weapon handling indicated familiarity with combat conditions, but his target selection seemed focused on maximum casualties rather than tactical objectives, which created opportunities for someone willing to exploit the difference between battlefield tactics and mass violence. As Sarah moved through the stacks with the silent precision of someone who had conducted combat patrols through hostile territory, her mind was running multiple tactical calculations simultaneously. Distance to target, available cover and concealment, civilian locations and safety zones, escape routes and emergency communication, the shooter's probable next moves based on his demonstrated pattern and tactical doctrine. Every variable was filtered through years of experience that had taught her the crucial difference between taking calculated risks and committing tactical suicide. The students huddled in their defensive positions could hear the careful, deliberate sounds of someone moving through the library with professional stealth, but they had no way of knowing whether those sounds represented their protection or their doom. The tactical silence that Sarah maintained wasn't dramatic. It was the practical application of noise discipline learned during operations where detected movement meant ambush and death. Every footstep was placed with the conscious precision of someone who understood that survival often came down to details measured in decibels and degrees of arc. But Sarah's greatest weapon wasn't her tactical knowledge or her movement skills. It was her absolute understanding of the stakes involved and her complete refusal to accept defeat when innocent lives hung in the balance. Combat medicine had taught her that impossible situations often had solutions that became apparent only to people willing to look beyond conventional thinking and accept risks that others wouldn't consider. She had learned to function in the space where hope and desperation intersected, where training and instinct combined to create possibilities that existed only for people who had been tested under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The woman who had once treated casualties while under direct enemy fire was now applying those same life-saving instincts to hunting a predator through an academic environment that had been transformed into a battlefield. The mission parameters were different, but the core objective remained exactly the same as it had always been for combat medic Martinez: protect the innocent, neutralize the threat, and never stop fighting until everyone possible had been saved. The theater of operations had changed from foreign combat zones to domestic terrorism, but the calling remained constant, and she was ready to answer that calling with every skill and every ounce of determination she possessed. In the space between heartbeats, as Sarah Martinez emerged from behind the reference stacks like a ghost materializing from shadow, the carefully constructed fiction of her civilian identity died forever. The shooter turned toward movement. He couldn't have anticipated expecting to find another terrified victim, but instead, discovering something that his tactical training had never prepared him to face: a combat veteran whose military occupational specialty had been preserving human life under the most dangerous conditions imaginable, and who was now applying those skills in reverse to end the threat he represented to innocent civilians. The hand-to-hand combat techniques she employed weren't the choreographed movements of movie fight scenes. They were the brutal, efficient methods taught to military police and combat medics who might find themselves separated from their weapons in hostile territory. Every strike was designed to disable rather than display, every movement calculated to end the confrontation as quickly and decisively as possible, while minimizing risk to the non-combatants who were depending on her for their survival. The woman who had once stabilized trauma patients under enemy fire was now applying her knowledge of human anatomy and physiology to stop someone who threatened the lives of people under her protection. The students who witnessed the confrontation saw something that would fundamentally change their understanding of heroism, courage, and the hidden warriors who walk among them in civilian clothes. Their quiet librarian, the woman they had known for years as someone who helped with research papers and enforced overdue book policies, revealed herself to be someone whose physical capabilities and tactical knowledge belonged to an entirely different category of human experience. The transformation wasn't gradual or dramatic. It was simply the sudden, overwhelming manifestation of someone whose true identity had been concealed by circumstances rather than choice. As police and emergency responders flooded the scene with the controlled chaos of a major incident response, Sarah's military bearing became impossible to hide or explain away. Her immediate shift into medical triage mode as she assessed and treated the minor injuries that had occurred during the evacuation revealed a level of medical knowledge and emergency response training that no civilian librarian could reasonably possess. Her calm, precise communication with first responders used terminology and procedures that spoke of extensive experience with law enforcement and emergency medical personnel in high-stress situations. Detective Maria Santos, the first investigator on scene, recognized military bearing when she saw it, and wasn't surprised when Sarah's background check revealed a service record that explained everything about her response to the crisis. Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, retired, with 12 years of active duty service including 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan as a 68W combat medic, 2 Bronze Stars with V device for valor, a combat medical badge earned under enemy fire and Army Commendation Medal for exceptional performance during mass casualty events, and a record of service that read like a textbook example of military excellence and dedication. The woman they had known as their librarian had been decorated for treating casualties during rocket attacks on Forward Operating Base. Shank had earned her second Bronze Star for single-handedly evacuating wounded soldiers while under direct small arms fire near Kandahar, and had been selected for promotion to Sergeant First Class before choosing to leave active duty to care for her aging parents. Her transition to civilian life hadn't been a rejection of military service. It had been the continuation of service through different means, using her organizational skills and attention to detail to serve her community in peacetime, rather than protecting her fellow soldiers in combat zones. The students who lined up to thank her in the aftermath discovered that their assumptions about quiet, unremarkable people had been shattered by contact with someone whose definition of normal had been calibrated by experiences most civilians couldn't imagine. Jessica Chen, whose athletic training had helped her follow Sarah's defensive instructions, found herself shaking hands with someone who had literally saved her life using skills learned on battlefields half a world away. Marcus Williams, whose ROTC training had helped him recognize military leadership in action, realized he had spent 2 years checking out books from someone whose military experience dwarfed that of most of his instructors. But perhaps the most profound discovery was made by Rebecca Foster, the nursing student who had helped treat minor injuries after the crisis ended. As she watched Sarah work with the calm efficiency of someone thoroughly familiar with trauma medicine, Rebecca realized she was observing someone whose medical training had been earned, not in sterile classroom environments, but in forward surgical hospitals, where split-second decisions determined who lived and who died. The gentle woman who had helped her find research sources for her anatomy papers had learned those same anatomical details while treating combat casualties under conditions that would break most people. The colleagues who had worked alongside Sarah for 3 years found themselves reconstructing every interaction and conversation in light of her revealed military background. Her insistence on proper procedures and attention to detail took on new meaning when viewed as the professional standards of someone whose military service had been built on the understanding that corners cut in preparation often became corners carved from coffins. Her legendary calm during stressful situations wasn't the result of a naturally placid temperament. It was the professional composure of someone who had learned to function effectively when lives depended on clear thinking under pressure. As the initial shock of discovery gave way to deeper understanding, the people who had known Sarah Martinez as their librarian began to comprehend the magnitude of service and sacrifice represented by her transition to civilian life. She hadn't left the military because she was tired of serving. She had left because she recognized that service took many forms, and sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons and tactics, but with patience and kindness in communities that needed healing rather than warfare. Her 3 years of civilian employment hadn't been an escape from her military identity. They had been the evolution of that identity into something that could serve others without violence. The woman who had once earned decorations for valor under enemy fire had spent the last 3 years earning the respect and affection of students and colleagues who needed someone to believe in their potential and support their educational goals. Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, retired, had become Librarian Sarah Martinez, not because she wanted to forget her military service, but because she understood that the skills learned in service to country could be transformed into tools for serving humanity itself. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in plain sight, and sometimes the greatest acts of heroism happen when nobody is watching except the people whose lives are being quietly, steadily saved. The weeks following the crisis brought a parade of reporters, investigators, and recognition that Sarah Martinez had never wanted, and certainly never sought, during her careful transition to civilian life. The woman who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisibility found herself thrust into a spotlight that illuminated not just her actions during the library incident, but the broader story of military service and veteran transition that her experience represented. Local news became national news, and national news became a symbol of something larger than any individual story: the hidden veterans who carry their training, their values, and their commitment to service into civilian communities across America. The military records that Detective Santos had uncovered told a story of exceptional service that humbled everyone who read them, but the records themselves could never capture the full measure of what Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez had accomplished during her 12 years of active duty. Her first Bronze Star had been earned during her second deployment, when she had single-handedly treated 17 casualties during a complex attack on her forward operating base, working for 6 continuous hours under indirect fire while coordinating medical evacuations and maintaining communication with higher headquarters. Her second Bronze Star told the story of a convoy ambush near Kandahar, where she had left the safety of her armored vehicle to treat wounded Afghan National Army soldiers, exposing herself to sniper fire, while providing medical care that saved 3 lives and prevented 2 amputations. But the decorations and official commendations could never tell the complete story of someone whose daily reality had been measured in lives saved, and soldiers returned to duty, whose professional identity had been built on the understanding that failure meant Gold Star families in flag-draped coffins. The combat medical badge that sat in her bedroom dresser represented not just training completed and standards met, but a philosophy of service that had defined every aspect of her adult life. The woman who had once been responsible for the lives of an entire infantry company's worth of soldiers had simply transferred that same protective instinct to college students who needed someone to believe in their potential and support their educational goals. The students whose lives she had saved began to understand that their rescue had been the product not just of courage in the moment, but of years of training and experience that had prepared her to function effectively when normal people would have been paralyzed by fear and confusion. Jessica Chen, whose volleyball scholarship depended on academic performance that Sarah had helped maintain through patient tutoring and research techniques, realized that her athletic career existed because of someone whose own achievements dwarfed anything that happened on sports fields. Marcus Williams discovered that the woman who had encouraged his military science studies was someone whose actual military experience exceeded that of most of his instructors and mentors. The broader community began to recognize Sarah's story as a microcosm of veteran transition challenges and opportunities that extended far beyond individual heroism. Mayor Davidson, whose own son had served in Iraq, used Sarah's example to launch a veterans recognition program that identified and supported the military veterans who were serving their communities in civilian roles. The college administration, initially embarrassed by their failure to recognize the extraordinary qualifications of someone they had hired as support staff, developed new programs to identify and utilize the skills of veteran employees and students. Dr. Patricia Williams, the college president, found herself reconsidering institutional assumptions about the relationship between academic credentials and practical capability as she reviewed Sarah's employment file. The woman whose job application had listed organizational skills and attention to detail as her primary qualifications possessed leadership experience and crisis management training that exceeded anything available in conventional academic programs. Her references had described her as reliable and thorough, but those bland civilian descriptors had completely failed to capture the professional competence of someone whose military service had been built on standards that civilian employers rarely encountered. The recognition ceremonies and media interviews that followed became opportunities for Sarah to speak about issues that extended far beyond her individual experience, addressing the challenges faced by veterans who were trying to translate military skills into civilian careers while maintaining their commitment to service and community. Her story became a powerful argument for programs that helped veterans identify civilian career paths that utilized their military training while providing the sense of purpose and mission that military service had instilled. She spoke eloquently about the difficulty of explaining military experience to civilian employers who had no frame of reference for understanding the leadership and responsibility that routine military service provided. But perhaps the most important recognition came from the veteran community itself, which embraced Sarah's story as validation of the service ethic that continued long after military uniforms had been exchanged for civilian clothes. Veterans across the country recognized in her experience their own struggles to find meaning and purpose in civilian careers that often seemed trivial compared to the life-and-death responsibilities they had carried in military service. Her successful transition from combat medic to community protector became a model for other veterans who were seeking ways to continue serving while building civilian lives and careers. The students who returned to the library after it reopened found that their relationship with Sarah Martinez had been permanently transformed by their shared experience of crisis and survival. They no longer saw her as background furniture in their academic lives, but as someone whose presence represented safety, competence, and the kind of quiet heroism that made normal life possible. The woman who had once been invisible had become a symbol of the extraordinary people who serve others without recognition or reward, whose greatest achievements often happen when nobody is watching, except the people whose lives are being quietly, steadily protected and improved. As Sarah Martinez settled back into her routine of shelving books and helping students with research projects, she carried with her the knowledge that her story had become part of something larger than individual recognition or personal achievement. Her experience had illuminated the broader truth that heroes don't always wear uniforms, that service takes many forms, and that the skills learned in military service never truly fade. They simply transform, ready to emerge when duty calls, and innocent lives depend on someone willing to stand between evil and those who cannot protect themselves. The woman who had once earned decorations for valor under enemy fire had discovered that the most important battle of her life had been fought not in the mountains of Afghanistan, but in the library of a community college where students needed someone to believe in their potential and protect their opportunity to learn and grow. Sometimes the greatest acts of service happen in the most ordinary places, performed by people whose extraordinary capabilities are hidden behind the gentle mask of civilian kindness. And sometimes the skills that save lives on foreign battlefields translate perfectly to protecting innocent people in the places where they should feel safest. Because heroism is not about the uniform or the battlefield. It's about the willingness to serve others regardless of the cost, and that willingness never truly leaves someone who has learned to measure their life by the lives they have saved. The quiet librarian who had been Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez would continue her service in civilian clothes, but her story had become a reminder that warriors walk among us every day. That service continues long after military careers end, and that sometimes the most important battles are won not with weapons and tactics, but with patience, kindness, and the absolute refusal to allow evil to triumph over innocence. In the end, Sarah Martinez had not just saved lives during a crisis. She had demonstrated that honor never fades, service never ends, and heroes are often hiding in plain sight ready to answer the call when duty demands and innocent lives hang in the balance.